Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel where we learn all things science. My name is Aubrey Molln, I'll be your presenter today, and today's topic is about growth hormones as well as insulin-like growth factors that come along in the process. So without further ado, let's get to it. So before we talk about the hormones, we need to talk about what system that they're a part of, which is the endocrine system. And this system is what helps deliver and process all the hormones throughout your body. And in this slide, we're going to review some large structures that carry out these processes and pathways. And let me go ahead and grab my laser pointer. The main thing that we're going to be focusing on here is the hypothalamus, which is the region of the brain that basically regulates the pituitary gland. And then also the pituitary gland itself that actually secretes hormones based on what the hypothalamus signals it to do. And as you can see here in the picture, we'll start over here, ladies first. We have the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the adrenal glands, and the pancreas, which males and females both have in common. And so just kind of highlighting what these do, the thyroid gland affects metabolism among other things. The parathyroid gland, which is, as you can see here, right there, that actually helps regulate the level of calcium in the blood. We come over here to the adrenal glands, which help trigger the fight or flight reflex. And then we have the pancreas, which helps regulate the sugar in your blood. And then we have gender, or I should say sex-specific organs, which include the ovaries for females, which is the sexual organ for females. And then we have the testes, part of the testicles, for males. So now that we have that background of the important structures of the endocrine system, now we'll be able to dive in deeper and learn more about the hormones that are exchanged between these major structures. So what is growth hormone? You can probably tell from its name that it actually is a type of hormone, also known as somatotropin, that helps regulate the rate of growth in the body. And we can kind of see here, let me grab my laser pointer, for all those nerdy scientists out there like myself, I really wanted to include what a growth hormone's chemical structure looked like. So this is actually growth hormone releasing hormone. Yes, it sounds kind of repetitive, but that's how you say it. And the secretion of the growth hormone is dependent on the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So like in the last slide, we're going to just reiterate these parts or these structures. The green is that hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that secretes the growth hormone releasing hormone into what is called the hypophyseal portal system. It also can be called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. But that is this little network of capillaries here that link that green hypothalamus in this picture to the yellow pituitary gland right here. So you can see how it has just a couple of vessels, a little network of capillaries, and then a couple other little vessels that then lead to the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. Anterior just means to the front part of. So the anterior pituitary has many different types of cells which are responsible for producing each type of hormone. The growth hormone releasing hormone binds to the surface protein on one of these cells, which is commonly referred to as a somatotroph. Okay, so hard words, but we're going with it, and stimulates them to release growth hormone, which is our little muscly cloud looking thing here. So you'll kind of notice a theme with some of these pictures in my slideshow. I got a lot of these illustrations from osmosis.org. I think that they did a really great job at making simple, easy to understand illustrations for these harder topics that we're going over, especially with the endocrine system. So I highly recommend osmosis.org. It's a great learning tool, and you can see here I left the watermark especially so you'll be able to recognize it if you would choose to look it up. Getting back on track, growth hormone releasing hormone is released in what is known as a pulsatile manner throughout the day, and it peaks 1 hour after you fall asleep. But it also is secreted in response to various other forms of stimuli, whether it's internal or external. It responds to both. For example, the hypothalamus senses when there's hypoglycemia being experienced in the body, which is also commonly referred to as low blood sugar. And in response, it secretes growth hormone releasing hormone. Exercise also causes the adrenal glands to secrete what's called epinephrine, which is another hormone, and that stimulates the hypothalamus to secrete growth hormone releasing hormone as well. Other things that would stimulate its release would be puberty, where the body is experiencing high levels of estrogen and testosterone, which stimulates the hypothalamus to release that growth hormone releasing hormone. And that is also the hormone that is responsible for, you've guessed it, growth spurts. Okay, so now we're at the point where the hypothalamus has been triggered by a stimulus, whether it's internal or external. It has released a hormone to the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary gland has started producing these growth hormone releasing hormones out into the body to do whatever function is needed. But at this point in time, you're starting to get a buildup of all of these growth hormone releasing hormones in the body. So how does this come to a stop? How do we stop the production of that particular hormone so the body's not overwhelmed with just one particular hormone in general? And this is when negative feed loops actually come into play. A negative feed loop is actually a reaction that causes a decrease in function. So typically it's in response to some kind of stimuli, and it causes the system to lessen the production of something in particular, in this case the growth hormone releasing hormone. And the reason it does this is it gives that, what you call, air quotes, the feedback to the particular organ that's producing it in order to start lessening the production and then bringing the body back into equilibrium, or also known as homeostasis. With that being said, growth hormone releasing hormone and the system in which it takes part in actually has three main negative feedback loops that take control. And the first one could be the increased levels of growth hormone releasing hormone in the bloodstream, which then signals the hypothalamus to stop making more once it hits a certain point. The second one is where the growth hormone reaches tissues such as your liver or your muscles or bones, and that's when that process makes something called somatomedians, which is also an insulin-like growth factor. And when these hormones are sent back to the anterior pituitary gland, it actually stops the production of that growth hormone by the pituitary gland. And then third and finally, the growth hormone and the insulin-like growth factors together signal the hypothalamus to produce what's called somatostatin, which is commonly referred to as the growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So we have three things going on. They're really, really similar in sound, but your growth hormone releasing hormone is commonly referred to as somatotropin. Your insulin-like growth factor is known as somatomedian, and your growth hormone inhibiting hormones is what's commonly referred to as somatostatin. So I know they're very close, but it's good to differentiate now instead of getting confused later. So somatostatin acts somewhat like a lawyer or a traffic cop that tells other endocrine organs to stop production of more hormones, just so the body doesn't become overwhelmed with that production of that hormone. In the pituitary gland, it blocks the growth hormone releasing hormone from acting on those somatotroph cells so that the secretion of the growth hormone is then stopped. In addition, the hypothalamus, the somatostatin is also secreted in the gastrointestinal tract, and that is done by the delta cells of the pancreas, where it inhibits the release of other hormones such as insulin, glucagon, and vasoactin intestinal peptides, as well as gastrin from the stomach and small intestines. Now, somatostatin is released in small amounts into the blood, just enough to reach that local target organ. So the somatostatin is released into the gastrointestinal system, and then the hypothalamic pituitary axis works independently. Okay, so that was a lot of words, and I just wanted to include this particular type of flowchart diagram of what exactly those three negative feedback loops would look like. This picture really helps me kind of organize it in my brain and kind of categorize those three distinct feedback loops. And you can see here that each are highlighted in a different color to help you differentiate. And I've actually put numbers next to them that correspond to which negative feedback loop they coordinate with or correspond to. So number one would be like that bloodstream feedback where it was pretty direct. After growth hormone is released from the anterior pituitary, the bloodstream will get so much of it that the absence of growth hormone, releasing hormone, is actually going to trigger the hypothalamus to be like, oh, we have a lot of growth hormone in there. We need to start backing off. Number two is where growth hormone goes to the liver, bone, and muscles, and it starts to trigger the production of somatomedian, which is that insulin-like growth factor, and that then goes back and helps inhibit the release of further growth hormone. And finally, that third one is where the somatomedian and the growth hormones come together to then trigger or release somatostatin, which is that growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So like I said, just kind of an add-on to the last slide here, but I think it just helps me kind of organize it in my brain a little bit better and to visually see where things are going and where they're coming from. All right, so we know what growth hormone is, we know what insulin-like growth factors are, and we know how the response for their production is triggered, as well as how their production is inhibited through negative feedback loops. But what do they really do for the body? And since growth hormones actually travel to the target tissues and organs, it stimulates growth in two ways through the bloodstream, which is directly and indirectly. Direct effects, if you look at the top of this slide, it includes growth hormones that stimulate the cellular metabolism, which then leads to tissue growth, which makes sense of how they got their name. In adipose tissue, it causes what's called lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fats for energy, and this then fuels the increased metabolism of other cells in the body. In the liver, it prompts what's called gluconeogenesis, which is the production of glucose, and glucogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen to give glucose. Another direct effect of growth hormone is that it increases the levels of insulin resistance in the tissues, which means insulin is no longer as effective as it once was in moving glucose into the cells. This leads to an increased amount of blood glucose levels. This glucose level that's been increased now also stimulates the release of even more insulin. And this actually has a very similar effect to those with diabetes. So the growth hormone effect that is causing this insulin resistance is what is often called this is a strange word to me, but it's diabetogenic. Moving on to the indirect effects, which is at the lower portion of this slide, growth hormones also have indirect effects, obviously, which are seen in certain tissues like the liver, the skeletal muscles, bones, and kidneys, where the growth hormone actually stimulates the steady release of a type of somatomedian called somatomedian C. This is also what's been called the insulin-like growth factor 1, or for short, IGF-1. This IGF-1 then binds to the insulin-like growth factor 1 receptors as well as insulin receptors and promotes cellular metabolism, which prevents cell death and increases the rate of cell division and differentiation throughout the body. So this is pretty significant for its role. In muscles, it stimulates amino acid uptake into the muscle cells, which helps with protein production and muscle growth. It is also the key hormone that stimulates the growth in length of long bones. IGF-1 also acts as an epiphyseal cartilage or growth plate of the bones and stimulates the activity of osteoblasts, which is bone cells, in the bones, and chondrocytes in the cartilage. This helps boost growth, particularly during growth spurts during puberty. So based off of what we just talked about with the direct and indirect effects of growth hormone and insulin-like growth factors, we can tell that it's pretty important to the growth and development of people or vertebrates in general. But when these feedback loops or processes for these growth hormones don't work correctly, what happens? And it's quite interesting because there are situations where something goes awry. Things aren't going right. So if you end up having too much growth hormones, what results is an increase in height during childhood, and the result is what's called giantism, which you can see to the left-hand side of the screen. But in adulthood, a change in height actually doesn't occur anymore. Instead, the increase in bone size is limited to the bones of your hands, your feet, and your face, and this condition is what you call acromegaly. On the opposite side of the spectrum, what happens if you get too little growth hormone? And the result of that actually tends to result in shorter than average height or delayed puberty, and can sometimes even result in dwarfism. These conditions is why it's very important that the endocrine system successfully regulates the amounts of hormones that are released into the body, especially growth hormones. Now that we have a good understanding of growth hormones and insulin-like growth factors, I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about some very interesting scholarly articles that I came across during my research. And I took many aspects from this particular journal article called Understanding the Multifactorial Control of Growth Hormone Release by Somatotropes. And in this article, it was very interesting because the authors talk about the origin and evolution of growth hormone and the connection that humans have with other vertebrates. And this could include fish, lizards, and even some birds. And it's interesting because they're talking about how growth hormone release can be triggered by many different peptide hormones. And the animals that they studied all had a particular release mechanism that could stimulate it. But in the end, the only true inhibiting hormone for growth hormones was the somatostatin, which is growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which we talked about in this lecture. So it's very interesting that they're able to kind of trace back what can trigger growth hormones and then what can hinder growth hormone release in different vertebrates and how they can connect it all together. And if you're interested, I put it in my citations below in the next slide, so it can be easily accessed if you are interested. Another peer-reviewed article that I definitely would suggest would be the neuroregulation of growth hormone secretion in domestic animals. And the reason I suggest this is because they have a lot of interesting research in pathways for the secretion of growth hormones and what neurotransmitters and neuroendocrine hormones help with the release and inhibiting of these factors. And they actually conducted their studies on domestic animals such as livestock, which include cattle, both milk producing and feeder. Then they also use sheep and swine in their experiment as well. And the chart that you see on the screen here is kind of the result of their findings for the actions and interactions of those neurotransmitters and neurohormones that they found secreted your growth hormone releasing hormone and your somatostatin, which is that inhibiting hormone in the livestock species tested. So I thought it was very interesting, and they have a very detailed article kind of summing up the results of what they found. And in particular, as you can see on the chart as well, some neurotransmitters and neuroendocrine hormones that they kind of highlighted would be your dopamine, your acetylcholine, your leptin, and your insulin-like growth factors. So As I said before, I highly recommend both of these articles. Again, the one is Understanding the Multifactorial Control of Growth Hormone Release for Somatotropes, and the other one is Neuroregulation of Growth Hormone Secretion in Domestic Animals. Again, I will be linking these and citing them in my references in the next page. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave comments in the comment section after this presentation. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you guys so much for coming out and learning about growth hormones and insulin-like growth factors. For those who are curious, the citations that are scrolling in front of you, number 2 and 4, are the scholarly articles that I highly recommend to read if you're curious. And I hope that you were able to take something away from this presentation. Again, thank you so much for coming out and listening to this, and I hope you all have a beautiful day.